Hey Diz, let's talk about the cognitive health crisis, or the mind crisis. In an earlier video, I started an analysis of Kyle Kulinski, a YouTube influencer on the political left, reacting to Tim Dillon, a comedian podcaster on the political right who has turned on Trump and the MAGA movement. I'm going to play a mashup of their arguments and rhetorical styles. Instead of analyzing them in turn, I want to focus on similarities. Both Kulinski and Dillon will show evidence of their vulnerabilities to the social and emotional patterns of contempt and paranoia. This video will focus predominantly on contempt, specifically their belief that it is low intelligence that leads people to be vulnerable to propaganda. I offer the representation of a Hydra with many heads to help visualize a social and emotional trap that our society is in right now. All heads of the Hydra represent a spectrum of affects ranging from healthy and adaptive to extreme and self-destructive. So, for example, there's a spectrum with healthy and adaptive confidence and competitiveness on one side, and as it becomes more and more toxic, devolves into smugness, elitism, contempt, and all the way to sadistic superiority. And likewise, there's a spectrum with healthy and adaptive skepticism and caution on one end that increasingly intensifies through suspicion, defensiveness, paranoia, and all the way to delusional persecution and reality collapse. Both Dillon and Kulinski will focus on the low intelligence of the people susceptible to MAGA propaganda. This is particularly egregious in Dillon's case, as it was only a couple years ago that he himself was one of those people. In Kulinski's case, isolating the issue to MAGA vulnerability obscures the larger vulnerability and so limits his ability to strategize against the larger phenomenon. In both cases, their sense of superiority over the vulnerability of people with low intelligence, a sense of superiority which I'd classify as hovering in the middle to strong range of the spectrum, from smugness to contempt, ironically makes them more vulnerable to manipulation than their knowledge and awareness would otherwise lead us to think. As far as their paranoia, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to resist diving into this right now. Suffice it to say, obviously as someone who spoke earlier of sadistic billionaires with projects of global domination, I am certainly on this spectrum, and I consider quite a lot of widespread suspicion legitimate. I believe widespread corruption exists. I believe powerful people engage in conspiracies. And so I think that as we approach the reality of our predicament, falling down rabbit holes of conspiratorial thinking and obsession with hidden motives is understandable. And I believe that's what's happening when Kulinski and Dillon, and many others, ignore the larger systemic corruption in the United States in favor of focusing on Israel as the real driver behind Trump's corruption and betrayal. As someone who raised my children to know about Israel's slow-moving genocide long before the very obvious fast-moving phase of recent years, I'm sympathetic to Israel's critics, but to those who want to turn Israel into the tail wagging the American dog, I'd emphasize that Israel is much more like a pimple on the American dog's anus. When the American dog shakes people down in the Middle East, it gives them an option to face them directly or face the trembling pimple ready to burst. The pimple is grotesque, but I'm telling you guys, it's the dog that's in charge. Okay, here's the mashup. Pay attention to how they approach the issue of people's vulnerability to propaganda.
One of the right-wingers who was certainly less wrong than other right-wingers is a guy by the name of Thomas Massie. Why do I say that? Well, he helped get the Epstein files released, along with Ro Khanna. He's been against this illegal war against Iran, and he's refused to take Israel lobby money. And so he's the exact kind of person that these anti-establishment right-wing thinkers view as serious. Like, oh, this is the guy, this is the one. Like, they all want him to run for president, right? That's what these people want. Well, Tim Dillon has a brutal realization about MAGA live on air here as he's talking about Massie versus Ed Galrine and how that race went down. So listen to what he says, and then we'll break it down. Here we go.
Everything in America right now, people get mad when I say this, I don't care. Everything is some type of psyop. And that doesn't mean that you should lose all contact with reality. But what I mean by that, okay, is that, and they're not even good. The psyops are not even good. They're not good. They're effective because you're aiming for the lowest common denominator. And the way they get you to do that is by shoving it down your throat. There's nowhere for you to go. You cannot escape. The only escape from this is death. You can't get away from it. War hero, war hero, war hero, war. They're in Kentucky doing whatever the fuck they do at a Waffle House. War hero, war hero, war hero, war hero. Navy SEAL, handshake, Navy SEAL, war hero, Navy SEAL. To a point where, like a horde of zombies, I guess they go into the voting booth and vote for this guy who's trying to quite literally kill their children. He wants their children dead, but because every day, war hero, Navy SEAL, handshake, war hero, loyal, America, patriot, America, look, you just get to a point you go, I don't even know what's up and what's down, what's real or what's fake. This is what I mean about a psyop. This is not a campaign. These are not campaigns, not campaigns about ideas where people are debating ideas. This is a psychological operation aimed at the lowest common denominator, lizard brain instincts that you have. War, hero, good.
MAGA is a psychological operation aimed at your lizard brain, pointed at the lowest common denominator. I could not have said that any better myself, Tim. So why'd you help them before the election? Why'd you have on J.D. Vance and give him a reach around? Why did you act like, oh, the Democrats, with their wokeness and their being too pro-establishment, the Democrats are the real problem. They're the real warmongers. Right, Tim?
War, hero, good, patriot, America, apple, pie, vote. It's like an EMP. It's like an electromagnetic pulse weapon that Adelson's got in Kentucky. War, good, hero, apple, America, pie, fam. This is what bothers me. It's not good. If you have a modicum of intelligence, it's not even good. I don't know how you run a country where people can just dump $32 million into a race. I think what it's showing you is that if you spend enough money, you can just create any reality you want.
Bingo. By the way, that's Trump's whole philosophy. That's his whole mindset. That's what he does. I've called it right-wing postmodernism or conservative postmodernism. What he does is he doesn't care about objectivity. He doesn't care about facts. He doesn't care about the truth. He doesn't care about reality. He creates his own reality through repetition. Come up with a narrative that he likes, come up with a story that he likes, repeat it over and over and over and over and over until suddenly the biggest warmonger we've ever known is the peace guy. He solved 8 wars even though he started 8 wars, right? This is what you do. You repeat it over and over and over and over and over. He's the master of branding. He's the master of PR.
You can create any reality you want. This guy who's like, release the Epstein files, hold people accountable, prosecute pedophiles, get out of foreign wars. That guy loses to a guy who's like, let's cover up the Epstein files. Let's not prosecute pedophiles. Let's go to war with your kids. You would think just platform to platform. That's a tough sell. Like, that's a hard sell.
Not when your movement is all 17 IQ absolute dipshits. When we say it's a cult, we're not doing it to, like, you know, be disrespectful or be edgy. No, we're saying it because it's true. It is absolutely true. And maybe now he's realizing it.
Both Polinsky and Dillon emphasize the low intelligence of people who fall for MAGA propaganda. In Dillon's case, the emphasis contrasts comically to his own words from 2 years ago. Dillon thought Trump would save our society. He thought the people calling Trump supporters dumb were arrogant. Now, he says MAGA propaganda is for people without a modicum of intelligence. 2 years ago, Dillon thought the people calling Trump supporters fascists were arrogant and crazy and foolish for being scared. Now, he says the MAGA project is run by people who want to kill your children. He says that it particularly bothers him that the propaganda isn't even good. It's just aimed at people's lizard brains, and if you have a modicum of intelligence, you can tell that it's not good propaganda. But good propaganda isn't necessarily a sophisticated intellectual argument, and this propaganda worked on Tim Dillon 2 years ago. Yet he oozes smugness and superiority. Why doesn't he see himself doing the thing he associates with low intelligence? Just as he looked 2 years ago out at those arrogant woke liberals, he now looks out at those stupid MAGA lizard brains. It's a missed opportunity to explore how this propaganda worked on his own lizard brain. In Kalinsky's case, never having been MAGA, It's more understandable for him to emphasize the low intelligence of MAGA lizard brains. But besides making jokes at their expense, there isn't anything actionable about tens of millions of people whose intelligence is so low that they're all vulnerable to flimsy propaganda. On the other hand, if we pay attention to the relationship between targets of flimsy, dangerous propaganda and those who fund such propaganda, then maybe we can find a way to interrupt or undermine the abusive exchange. To be clear, it's not a problem that Dillon and Kulinski question the intelligence of MAGA. The problem is the lack of attention on our vulnerability to propaganda because we are social, emotional beings. For every X amount of time spent making fun of the low intelligence of people who fall for flimsy, dangerous propaganda, we should see more than X amount of time spent normalizing the idea that we are all vulnerable to propaganda. People with an audience who want to mitigate against or reverse our society's vulnerability to propaganda should explore their own vulnerability to propaganda and publicly work through that vulnerability. The admission of vulnerability to propaganda should be normalized. We're all vulnerable to propaganda, not just dumb people. Linking vulnerability to being dumb is not only wrong, it raises the social cost of admitting to vulnerability. If it's hard to admit you were a sucker, it's harder to admit you're a sucker and one of the dumber people in society. But again, vulnerability to propaganda isn't about low intelligence. In the mind crisis framework, making it common sense that we are all very vulnerable to propaganda is a necessary and fundamental condition before more aggressive moves against our adversaries are possible. Let's go back to Tim Dillon. From a certain perspective, it's obvious that something is going on in his mind that allows him to keep the realization at bay that he himself has a public record of being very vulnerable to propaganda that he now calls not good that targets his lizard brain. So if it's not intelligence, what is it? Tim Dillon is vulnerable to propaganda not because of his low intelligence, but because he is a human being with social and emotional patterns. And he was specifically vulnerable to MAGA propaganda just 2 years ago because of his specific social and emotional situation. His legitimate suspicions open him up to developing conspiratorial thinking and paranoia, and eventually that can be used to collapse his connection to reality altogether. His confidence and competitiveness can be fanned into arrogance and contempt, limiting his ability to work with people outside his bubble. His motivation to fit into a social group can transform his patience and contentment into comfort seeking, complacency, minimization, and willful blindness. He has those social emotional patterns and others, and he lives in a world where we allow a class of sadistic and corrupt individuals to amass grotesque fortunes that they use as a sword and a shield to entrench us further and further into those social emotional patterns to keep us divided and conquered. And just because Tim Dillon finally figured out that MAGA is a con does not at all indicate that he's getting himself untangled from the Hydra. The more likely scenario is that he will plunge further down the rabbit hole toward reality collapse. Why? Because he has not identified what makes him vulnerable to the type of psychological operations that convinced so many people, including him, into supporting a very obvious con man. He still speaks as if this is a matter of intelligence, to the extent that anyone believes that they are too intelligent to be manipulated. That belief itself is a vulnerability to be exploited by our adversaries. That belief is a door that leads to the Hydra's domain.